Say minutes, but it's seconds.
Mhm.
Hey everyone, and welcome to Chef AJ Live. I'm your host, Chef AJ, and this is where I introduce you to amazing people like you who are doing great things in the world that I think you should know about. As often happens with this show, one guest refers another guest, and Linda Middlesworth, the queen of veganism in Sacramento, said, "You must have my friend and author, Jonathan Balcombe, on. He's written many books. He's been in many documentaries, and we're going to talk about some of his books, and we're going to actually be talking about the inner life of animals from fish to flies. Please welcome all the way from Canada, Jonathan Balcombe. It's nice to Zoom meet you.
Great to be here, AJ.
Yeah, we were talking a bit before you came on about, two of your more recent books. One is on fish, one is on flies. And I'm thinking, how do we get people to care about fish and flies when they don't even care about other animals? They eat cows and pigs and things like that. And there are people that really don't even care about domesticated animals. And what I mean is, I'm not talking about people that actually abuse animals, that are psychopaths, but there are people that'll get a dog or a cat and then, oh, I'm moving, and then they'll take it to the shelter. It's like, how do we get people to care at all?
Yeah, I've always been drawn to the less popular animals, the more misunderstood, the more maligned, and fishes certainly qualify there. And one could say flies, although flies certainly abuse us. Mosquitoes are flies, and very few people like mosquitoes. But really, I could give a selfish answer to your question, and that is that if we didn't have fishes, we wouldn't be having this conversation. If we didn't have flies, we wouldn't either, because they run the planet. They're diverse groups of animals. They're critical members of food webs. They're as food and as feeders themselves, both flies and fishes. Flies are also what's often, a few people know this, that flies are right up there just behind bees as pollinators. So in terms of the food we eat, and I'm sure a lot of the people watching the show don't eat meat, but if you eat plants, then you totally get it, that we need the pollination of plants. But for people who eat meat still, people are still eating animals, God rest their souls, those animals had to eat plants too to make their meat. So we all depend on insects for our own food, not because we eat them directly, although that is a growing industry we can talk about, but because of the pollination services of the production of food that we then eat. They're absolutely critical. If we disappeared, there'd be some disappointed flies out there, but the flies would continue to thrive, as would fishes. The opposite is not true. If either of those two groups of animals disappeared, we're out of here, because we need them to survive.
But people don't think about them, Jonathan. Not very many people. Would you agree?
Well, I would say part of my job as an ethologist and an author of books is to get a few more people thinking about them. And we do the work we do because we're optimistic. We're glass half fullers. We think the world can be a better place. We have some faith in people to open their eyes, pay attention, and learn. Not everybody maybe, but a lot of people will do that. And I hear from people regularly who have changed their lifestyle habits because of something they read in one of my books. And that's a great compliment and a great reward.
Yeah. So let's talk a little bit about you. When did you first become plant-based and why?
I went vegetarian in 1984. I'd always loved animals. I was 25 years old then, and I scratched my head as to why it took me that long to make that step, given that I always loved animals from my earliest memory. I was preparing to go on a trip to India, which I did. I traveled to India for 3 months, and India, as you know, has half a million vegetarians, Hindus. So it seemed like a logical place and time to make that step in my life. I was vegetarian for 5 years before I became fully vegan. I made that decision because I learned that, well, the animals who we use for dairy products and eggs, they too are going to go to the slaughterhouse. So they pay with their lives, but they just get to get tortured a little bit more beforehand by being kept in battery cages or kept in dairy farms, having their calves taken away from them at birth and this sort of thing. So to be consistent with my personal ethics, and the reason I stopped eating animals was because I didn't want them to be harmed for my benefit. I was having none of that. So the same reason, really. So that's 1989. I stopped consuming all animal products from that point.
Yeah. Did you grow up just eating the standard American diet?
No, I grew up eating the standard British and New Zealand diet because that's where we lived for the first 8 years of my life, and then Canada. So, yes, in a way, my parents they loved animals too, and I think they subconsciously made the connection. We weren't big time meat eaters, never was. As an undergraduate, before I became vegetarian, I always chose the plant. If there was a plant-based option, it wasn't called that. If there was a vegetarian option at the at the dorm cafeteria, I would choose that. So I was aware of it. I just hadn't made the plunge. I hadn't made that commitment. So it took a while, as it
Yeah.
does for so many people.
And some people never get it, do they?
No.
I once heard someone say, if you love animals called pets, how can you eat animals called dinner?
Yes, it's a nice bumper sticker. I saw a more strident one on the car of the Mad Cowboy. I'm forgetting his name. What's his name? Do you
Howard
remember?
Lyman.
Howard Lyman. That's right. Yes. Heart disease, God's reward for eating his friends. That was a pretty in your face
That's
bumper
interesting.
sticker.
Well,
Yeah.
it's I didn't even eat fish when I ate fish, if you know what I mean. And like, I mean, I grew up, most of us grew up eating animals. And I mean, especially us older folks, because our parents, like my mom wouldn't let me be vegetarian. I couldn't really do it like exclusively. I suppose I could have gotten a job and gotten some money, but until I left home at 17, I kind of ate what she ate. And I never ate things that looked like animals. You know what I'm saying? And the thing about fish is fish look like fish. And I guess what I'm trying to say is when you eat a chili and there's pieces of ground beef, you're not necessarily seeing the bones, right? But to me, like fish, it always looked like the fish. And it's like, I could never eat something that looked like what it was. Does that make sense? So I never ate fish when I ate fish.
Yeah. I think we do kind of like that separation if we can have it. And the fact that we call a lot of meats by different names like beef and pork. We do say lamb, interestingly. A lamb, as most of us know, is a baby sheep. So even there, we're not consistent with that. But I find it interesting, as we were talking about before we started the show, people, health and weight loss talks to people more than ethics. I always feel like the ethics are the most powerful reason to not harm other animals, but more people seem to be reached by I don't want to say selfish, but things that they know they can benefit directly themselves. As far as I'm concerned, it makes no difference to the animals. I think there's many good reasons for going plant-based, and the animals, if they could express it, they would say they love us for doing that.
Well, I agree with you that, and I hate to use the word selfish, but I think more for their own benefit, because when I think about it, I used to work in animal rights, and God bless the people that do it. I cannot work in rescue or animal rights anymore. I'm just too sensitive for that. And I'm so thankful for activists that do that. But in my teens, before I was exposed to all the horrors, I would do some things. Even I wouldn't do civil disobedience because I didn't want to go to jail because I had pets and I wasn't married, but I would do direct action and work with groups like that. And I noticed when I was working just in animal rights and I would do tabling and I'd have, the posters with animal experiments, nobody seemed to care. But then when Forks Over Knives came out and people thought, wait, I can look good. I can feel good. I can reverse heart disease. So I'm very thankful for these documentaries. But I agree with you that at the end of the day, the ethics is the piece that if you don't have it, you can always go back, because you could reverse your heart disease and still have salmon once a month, probably. But if you're an ethical vegan, you're never going to cross that line, and that may be under severe starvation conditions, but you know what I'm saying? And but I do find that sometimes when people go vegan for reasons of health or environment, eventually that compassion piece will come. Absolutely. And then they'll be like, okay, yeah, I'm going to do this for my heart disease, but I'm not giving up my fur coat or my leather belt. But then the more they're entrenched in not eating animals, the more empathetic they become, because I think it's hard to be empathetic when you're eating them.
Yeah, that's right. We don't like to repudiate a lifestyle that we've lived for years or decades or longer, because it's hard to sort of say what I've been doing is wrong. It takes a certain person, or they need to be in a certain phase of their life to do that. I think it's a very mature thing to do, but most people aren't like that. And the flip side is, as you say, once people have stopped consuming animal products, they no longer have that need to have the defenses up. They're no longer pushing back all the time. Suddenly they open up, and their heart opens to the other reasons why it's good to not eat animals, and they become much more subject to the ethical arguments. I've seen that too, and it's great to see, and it's part of moral change. Consider that within the last 2 to 3 centuries, we've seen such sweeping changes in our behavior as a species. I'm speaking now of colonialism, the institutionalized slave trade, the denial of civil rights to people of color, and the voting rights for women, which is still, just a century ago, most women in the world had no voting rights. Almost all of them do now. I wish it was all, but it's practically all of them. Those are sweeping moral changes. Yes, they're all human domain issues, but I think the next great social advance for humans is the understanding that we're not the only sentient beings whose lives matter on this planet, and we need to protect the other ones too. So the emancipation of animals, the recognition of animal rights, it's within reach for humanity. We're already moving in the right direction. Hopefully that pace of change will accelerate. It's far and away the most challenging because the subjects of our concern are not out on the streets protesting themselves. I think they're very compelling in protesting in their own ways, but largely we're blind to this. We don't see it. The industries that use them bend over backward to keep us in the dark about what's going on. But I do believe that the recognition of animal rights is the next great social advance for humankind.
I hope so, because, I'm not condoning eating animals, but there are people that believe they need to for whatever reason. But to use animals in ways that are not necessary for survival, not that eating them is, but there are people that believe that. Things like zoos, circuses, cosmetic testing. See, that stuff, even people that eat meat can sometimes get behind,
Yeah, and it's all connected. I like to think that if people have recognized that it's wrong to incarcerate animals in tiny cages and eat them, then they're going to make the connection at some point that a zoo is essentially doing that as well. Maybe not with the eating part, but it's incarceration. And if you look closely at some of the practices of some of the less reputable zoos, it's pretty bad for the animals. So again, I tend to take a glass half full view of humanity, of my own species. I think we're capable of great progress and positive steps.
Yeah, but when? I'm 62 and I've been vegan for 45 years. When is it going to happen? In my lifetime?
Welcome to the 62 Club. That's my
Oh.
age as well. When is it going to happen? Well, I take great delight in turning on. Okay, I'm a sports fan, Toronto Maple Leafs. I grew up in Toronto. I turn on the TV and I watch the Leafs game, and I see light life on the boards of the rink, and I see products that are plant-based. And then the ads come on, and there's an ad for Silk plant-based milk, or there's an ad for some fast food chain that's introducing Beyond Meat into their menu. That's mainstream television, and that's reaching a lot of people. And then if I go down to the supermarket or across to the sports bar across the road, it's called the Dugout, by the way, I can order a Beyond Burger there. I have done that, partly just to let them know that I appreciate them having that on their menu. It's not a healthy meal. It's a delicious meal, though, and it's a meal that a lot of people who eat meat would enjoy, in the sense of it being very meat-like. All this, and maybe a lot of your viewers know this as well, but I take a lot of solace from that. It's really encouraging to see that happening.
Yeah, but so many people think it's their right to eat animals, to exploit them. And I love the motto of PETA: animals are not ours to eat, wear, or experiment on. Has that always been the case throughout all of human history, that people felt that way, the moral superiority to sentient beings?
I wasn't walking the earth 1,000 years ago, but I have a sense that it wasn't even thought about. It was about survival and getting what you needed to survive for most of the people on the planet, until recent times. And we just didn't have the luxury of knowing when our next meal was going to be on the table. So I think it's a fairly recent phenomenon that we reflect morally, that we become moral agents and reflect morally on our behavior towards other species. Towards humans, maybe that has a richer history, and perhaps that was the precursor to expanding our circle of moral concern to other species. But I think it's a relatively new phenomenon for our species.
Yeah. Let me find it. I love the way you sign your emails with a quote from Martin Luther King. Cowardice asks the question, is it safe? Expediency asks the questions, is it politic? Vanity asks the question, is it popular? But conscience asks the question, is it right?
Yeah, we all should be asking that question, is it right? It's a fundamental question. And another thing that encourages me, AJ, is that most humans have a moral sense. We have this moral capacity because we recognize when certain things are wrong. It's wrong to steal. It's wrong to harm another gratuitously. People have a very strong concept of rights because they believe in human rights. Most people believe in human rights. We can talk about exceptions to that and types of xenophobia, but most people get it. Why? Because they live in their own bodies, and we have our own sense of belonging and importance, and we recognize our own rights, and we can expand that to others. So the concept of rights is there. The concept of the moral value of protecting another who's maybe vulnerable and who can be harmed is there. It's just a matter of expanding the limitations of that.
Yeah.
I say just, hardly an easy task, but it's doable.
Absolutely. Like when I was thinking, I mean, I never, your book about flies, I read as much of it as I could in the book about fish. I never really thought, it's not that I go around killing flies at all, but my husband has a system. I don't know how he does it. He takes a plastic bag and he traps them and he releases them, kind of catch and release. And then for the other bugs, since we moved to the desert, there's so many more. We use something called a bugzooka. I don't know if you know what that is.
Like as in the word bazooka?
Yeah, but it doesn't kill them. It's a relocating tool, and it's this long. I could show it to you. I can get it, and you kind of it sucks them up very gently, and then you go outside, and it opens up.
I have one. Someone sent me. It's a different one. It's called a critter catcher, I think it is, and it's also remote. It's long handled, and you push the handle, and then it opens up these tines, and they close down gently on the spider or what have you. I haven't tried it yet because I got it in the fall. Someone sent me one, but I actually have my own system as well. A piece of cardboard and a plastic container, slip the cardboard underneath. I actually have a method for putting the lid on the container, but you don't have to do that. And you go outside. Yeah. And I feel like every time I let that trapped animal go outside, I liberate a little bit of my own soul as well.
Well, I'm sure they would rather be outside.
Yeah, that's what they want to do. That's why they're banging against the window, right?
Right. I never thought about flies as animals, though. I mean, I think of them as insects. Is there a difference between an insect and an animal?
Well, biologically, an animal is, insects are certainly a member of the animal kingdom, or queendom if you prefer. In fact, insects make up most animals on Earth. They're 80% of all animal species that we can see are insects. So technically, absolutely, they're animals. People maybe don't have the right concept of what animal defines, but it's a very broad term. We're animals. Giraffes are animals. Fishes are animals. Insects are animals. Octopuses, most invertebrates are also animals.
Wow. Because, I mean, I don't kill insects. I mean, not intentionally, but when I think about it, flies, for example, can be a nuisance to people. And, you go to any store, including the grocery store, the 99-cent store, and they sell fly swatters. And I think about it because it's like a specific item to kill something, right? To kill a specific, species. And other animals eat other animals and they kill them. But it seems like human beings are the only species that kill things for reasons other than survival.
Yeah, well, yeah, that's pretty true. I mean, it's dangerous for wild animals to kill other animals. So being a predator is hard work, and it's dangerous to do that. You can get injured each time, and so they only kill what they need. Typically, there are rare exceptions to that. Animals may stockpile food, but that's usually the vegetarians who are stockpiling acorns and nuts for the winter and that sort of thing. But flies are, I call them entrepreneurs. There's 160,000 described species of flies in the world. There's an estimate of about 2 million 20 million flies for every human. So they vastly outnumber us. They're arguably more successful than we are. They also don't mess up their own homes. I'm speaking now of pollution and climate change, all the things we do that are actually ultimately coming back to haunt us. The pandemic, not entirely unrelated to that. But flies, like other animals, they benefit the planet that they live on through their cleaning services, through their being parts of food chains, and of course, as I mentioned, through their pollination systems.
Well, if there's more of them than us, why don't they mutiny?
Maybe their attraction to our blood is their way of giving us the I don't know.
Yeah. Is Zen, who's watching live, says, is it true that when the bees are gone, we are gone?
Yes, completely, because they're huge pollinators. The flies will do their bit to make up for the loss if we lost bees, but bees are just far too important, and there's thousands of species, and they they help to stabilize the planet, and they produce food through their pollination services. We really harm them at our peril. It's estimated we've lost about half of all the insects from the planet in the last 50 years. Exactly the same estimate for fishes as well. This is all part of why we're seeing worse weather patterns, why we're having a pandemic, why we're hearing about biodiversity loss. I don't know if you've seen the film Don't Look Up. I just saw it recently, and
Yes, loved
it's
it.
sort of, yeah, it's a way of conveying that we just don't take this stuff seriously enough. We tend to have to make big mistakes before we learn from them, and this one, the mistakes we're making right now, I'm hoping we're responding soon enough, but it is considered a deadly existential crisis that we're in the midst of. And I'm not talking about the pandemic, I'm talking about climate change, but both of them are right up there.
Do you think that one of the reasons people that even so-called animal lovers don't gravitate as much to maybe fish or flies or other insects is because they're not like warm and fuzzy and cuddly like cats and dogs?
Sure, partly that. I think with the case of fishes, they have the disadvantage of being until recently out of our view. It's only in the last century that we've developed scuba gear and underwater cinematography that we can go and witness them up close. And also a sweeping change in science. For much of the 20th century, science was not asking questions about how do animals think, how do they feel, do they have emotions? That was taboo. And now in the last 30, 40, 50 years, thank goodness, we shed that bias, and now scientists are asking questions about does sex feel good for a fly? Do fishes have culture? Is there tool use in insects? Is there tool use in fishes? The answer to all of those is yes, and beyond. There's so much more that they do, So we're in an era where we're actually bringing to light the sophistication, the beingness, the individuality, the personalities, the culture, the cognition, the emotion, the cooperation, the virtue. The list goes on that these animals are capable of. And when I say that list, I'm thinking more about fishes than flies. But even insects and flies, there's studies now showing they've got complex brains. Nature is a master miniaturizer, and through evolutionary time, insects evolved as small creatures, but it doesn't mean that they're necessarily lacking anything the bigger creatures have. They have an attention span, they can make rational decisions. Bumblebees can learn by observation, learn by watching other bumblebees pull out a string to get food. They can watch a video of a bee doing that, or in real life, and then they'll go and pull the string because they saw the other bee pull the string. So the behaviors that wasps recognize each other by their faces. They have unique faces like we do. And wasps, they're social insects in a colony. If scientists jumble up the faces through digital images and then present them to the wasps, they don't like that. They don't let them into their hive. But if they're the actual face, they'll let them in. So we have face recognition. Stuff like that. I like to think it helps us to recognize that these animals are much more complex individuals than we thought they were.
Do they have empathy? Do they have intelligence? Do they feel pain?
Empathy, that's a good question. I would say fishes may be capable of that, but certainly intelligence and pain. Very much, there's been debate about that, both with fishes and insects in the past. Fishes, the evidence now, amassing evidence, is very, very strong. Fishes who have been injected with a painful an acid, say, for instance, will stop feeding. They will rub the injured part against the gravel at the bottom of their tanks. They will also swim to an area where they would normally avoid to get painkillers. If the scientists make painkillers available, they drop it in the water. The fish who would normally avoid it because it's a brightly lit area with nowhere to hide will go over there to get painkillers and then come back to the safe area after they're feeling better. So the selection of to taking advantage of an opportunity to relieve pain and paying a cost for that is very compelling evidence for pain. With insects, still more debate, more doubt, but we have studies like more and more noted scholars think that insects probably feel pain, and I believe in the precautionary principle, which is that if you think they can feel pain, assume they do and treat them accordingly. I think it's an important moral consideration. But there's studies where insects can be put on a hot plate, which gradually heats up, and you see when does the insect run off the plate, presumably because it hurts. You give them morphine, they take longer to run off because they're in pain relief. You give them a drug, naloxone, that reverses the effect of morphine, then they run off faster again. So that speaks to another phenomenon that's interesting to know, is the incredible conservation of biological phenomena. An insect responds to morphine in the same kind of ways that we do, despite being separated through evolutionary time by several 100 million years. They have morphine response, they have a dopamine system, we do as well, and they respond in a way that's consistent with what we'd expect for an animal who feels pain. And a fly who's had a leg amputated 6 weeks ago is more sensitive to a painful stimulus today than another fly who didn't have an amputation. These are the kinds of, I'm not necessarily endorsing these studies, AJ, because they're not always very animal friendly, but these are the kind of studies that scientists are designing and conducting, which show they do feel negative affect. They do seem to feel pain, and they respond in an appropriate fashion.
Yeah. Linda wrote in a question wanting to know, how do we know that fish are self-aware? And could you talk about the puffer fish?
Yeah, starting with self-awareness. There was a study published 3 or 4 years ago with cleaner wrasses, which are small reef fishes who do perform cleaning services on other so-called client fish. To it's a classic mutualism. The cleaner wrasses remove parasites like sea lice and algae and things, so they get food. And the client fish, which can be, there's more than 100 known species. It can include sharks, sea turtles, eels, etc. They get a parasite removal service and a spa treatment, a cleaning, a nice cleaning up. And some of these client fish become almost addicted. They go back to this regularly, and that's actually significant because it behooves the cleaners to know how often it is that an individual client is coming back, because a client fish who last came back 3 hours ago is going to have a lot fewer parasites on them than one that last visited a week ago. So their little fish brains are able to track and keep accounts of how long it's been since their last client came. Now to the self-recognition, the usual test of self-awareness in an animal is to present them with a mark, give them a mark where they can't see it. In this case, they did a mark down here on the fish where they couldn't see it themselves, and then put them in front of a mirror. And if they swim behind the mirror or just do a threat display or swim away, it suggests they don't recognize themselves in the mirror. But if they change their position so that they can see the dot, and they try to rub it off, and they try to remove it by rubbing against the bottom, which is what some of these fishes did when they saw this gel dot put on them, that suggests that they recognize that who they're seeing in the mirror, and I use the word who deliberately here, is themselves. And these cleaner fishes, quote unquote, passed the test. They passed that mirror test. There are other scientists who poo-poo this. They say, no, that can't be right. It's a fish. They're not willing to believe that a fish is capable of that. But with all the other things that fishes have shown their capability to do, I'm very, very convinced by that study. So there's other studies as well, but that's the best one on self-recognition. Do you want me to mention pufferfish now?
Yeah, tell us a little bit about that.
Well, I don't know how many species, many dozens, probably maybe even hundreds. There's a YouTube video that went viral of a pufferfish. A couple of teenage guys who came along, and they had a GoPro camera with them, so they were able to film this. And this video was very popular, where there was one pufferfish trapped in a discarded fishing net. Fishing nets wreak havoc, as you know. Couldn't get out. And then there was a second pufferfish, presumably the mate, who was hovering nearby, swimming there. And this guy came in while the other guy filmed it. The guy found a piece of broken glass and started cutting away the netting that this first fish was caught in. The second fish kept vigil, remained on the spot, even though these are scary humans. Humans are scary to fish, let's face it. There's good reasons for them feeling that way. But this other one stayed there until finally the young guy managed to cut free this second pufferfish, and off they swam together. It's a beautiful video in terms of it having a positive outcome, but I think the poignancy of the video is it shows the devotion of this other pufferfish. There's a lot of neat stuff about pufferfish. They do a lot of cool things. There's one species that builds fantastic 6-foot wide Mandela-like nests that's been filmed by the BBC and others. This fish was only discovered barely a decade ago, and they build these beautiful patterns in the sand. The male does it to attract the female, and they lay their eggs there. It's sort of like the peacock example in a fish.
Wow, that's amazing. You were in Seaspiracy.
I was, yeah. I was contacted by the filmmakers and they came and visited me, set up all the cameras and talked to me for 2 hours and then used about 15 seconds in the film. That's terrific. I was very proud to be in the film. It's perhaps the only moment of levity in the whole film, actually. I mean, it's a very grave subject and a very important one. And I think they did a very fine job. But I was very, very pleased to be in there. You know, that's what you get for writing a book. It makes you an expert. I studied bats as a biologist. I didn't study fish, but I've always been fascinated by them. And these days with the internet, you can become an expert. You can look things up. You can look at the studies. And I went and met with people and talked to them. And I'm a synthesizer. I didn't do the original research on the fishes, but I'm able to. I have a skill at bringing it together into one package, a book, and making that information accessible and available to non-scientists who are interested in reading that sort of thing.
You mentioned earlier you were an ethologist. What does that mean?
Yeah, an ethologist is somebody who studies animal behavior. It's as simple as that. So for my undergraduate degree, for instance, I did a project where I looked at bat communication and I looked at how bats actually use the echolocation calls of other bats who are out there foraging and trying to catch insects. It's a patchy distribution, and young naive bats don't know where to go. The evidence supports this. So they listen to that cocktail party over there. It's like all those bats are calling, so they fly that way. I used playback experiments to show that the bats do that, particularly young bats. And then for my PhD, I studied vocal recognition, voice recognition in the Mexican free-tailed bat. This is a bat where they migrate from Mexico and they colonize these huge limestone caves, just a half a dozen or a dozen of caves in the Southwest, Texas and New Mexico and the like. And each mother has one pup, and there's some of the bigger caves, there's close to 10 million babies in there. And you could go into the cave and put your hand on the surface, you'd be touching the heads of 100 baby bats, tiny little pinkies. They're called pinkies because they're pink and they're about the size of our pinky finger. How on earth does that mother find her baby in that cave several times a day to nurse the baby? Because these are mammals, they feed them milk. She does it with a combination of spatial memory, where she knows the topography of the cave and can probably narrow it down to a few thousand hungry, calling, aggressive bats who will nurse with any mother. Mothers try to nurse their own pup. And then she listens to the baby's call. This was the part I did playback experiments where they could listen to the calls of different babies, and they would choose their own baby's call, or the one who they'd been found nursing. And you can confirm that with genetic studies. So, and then they sniff them. They also have a unique scent signature. They produce a smell at the nape of the neck, I think it is, from a gland. Yeah. They're rather oily, smelly bats, but they're cute as buttons. They're really very cute faces. And they're able to find and nurse their baby several times a day using this combination of spatial memory, voice recognition, scent recognition. When you pick up the phone and your friend's calling, you know who it is before they even tell you. You know it's your mom, you know it's your sister, you know it's your friend who lives in the next town over, because of the voice. So we certainly can relate to that. They have to be very good at voice recognition because otherwise they won't find their own kin in the cave.
Yeah, that's fascinating. Amal was saying, what do you think about people saying, we should be starting to eat insects because there's more of them and it'll, help alleviate some of the burden from eating the other animals?
Yeah, it gives me a weird feeling, not because of the yuck factor so much as the fact that there is emerging science for sentience in insects, and I do write about this in my book Superfly. And there's companies now who are developing the mass production of maggots, fly larvae. The black soldier fly is a superb recycler of compost. Anyone in North America puts out a compost pile. I think even elsewhere, there's other species that do this. And within a year, you'll have black soldier fly colonies. They're quite beautiful as adults. They're not particularly beautiful as larvae, but they're voracious feeders and they create compost very efficiently. Well, they're being grown by the billions now by these companies as animal feed, which I think is not the way to go. We need to move away from eating animals. You know that as well as anyone does. Also, cat food, dog food, pet food. It's high protein, of course, pretty high fat. as fertilizer. There's a lot of uses, a lot of areas where these companies are developing this. And again, I write about this in my book. It's a troubling area because I think we need to be mindful of the sentience of insects, and it's a factory farming type thing. Is it as disturbing to me as chicken farming or cow farming or pig farming? No. And maybe that's my own bias, but it's very clear that those other vertebrate animals are highly sentient and with complex psychologies that are terribly damaged by these industries.
So when people step on a spider or fumigate a cockroach, they're experiencing pain.
I'm experiencing pain to witness it, I can tell you that. But yeah, I suspect that an animal as complex as a spider and a cockroach, and there's studies that show they will run off, they will run away sorry, I just had to plug in my laptop in. They will run away from a painful stimulus. So yeah, that's problematic. There's probably something that happens.
So what do people do? How do we cohabitate? Because, like for example, where I live, there's a lot of black widow spiders, and the veterinarian said, if this spider bites your little dog, it's going to be fatal. You need to exterminate. So how do you coexist and be safe and yet be humane to insects?
I turn to your husband and do what he does.
Right.
It's humanely remove them from your house if you don't want them in the house. I live in a condo here, and I've campaigned with limited success to stop an annual spraying. That's just sort of an automatic thing. I stopped it one year. Last year it went ahead, even though I had a neighbor. I got a neighbor who has grandchildren coming into the house. There are illnesses that are being linked to exposure to pesticides. We have so many chemicals coming at us in the modern era. I think that it's the wrong move to poison the places we live, because we have an antipathy towards creatures who are sharing our home. I have any number of house spiders who live in here. When I sweep the floors, which I don't do as often as I should, the spiders would say I do it too often. If I see them fleeing, I make sure I don't harm them. They're very quiet. They don't disturb me. They create some cobwebs, but they also maybe catch occasional insects. I feel bad for them. There's not a lot of insects hanging around in my apartment, but I think a bit more tolerance, live and let live, would take us far.
There seems to be like a little bit of an uck factor or a creep factor where some insects are concerned.
Totally. I mean, and I think a lot of that we learn as children. We are imbued with that through the behavior we see of grown-ups. We look up to the grown-ups as the wise ones, and turns out when we get older, they realize they're not that wise after all. But most of those things are learned behaviors, not innate. And there's an interesting phenomenon called nature deficit disorder. It's a term that was introduced in a book some years ago. Unfortunately, a lot of young people in the modern era grow up in cities, and they really have very little exposure to nature. And they probably learn these negative lessons, and rather than learning the positive lessons you can learn by going out into the woods or going into local marsh, looking around and seeing animals in their own milieus, and leading meaningful lives to them. So that's another thing I try to do through my writing. I mean, I have a children's book that I don't know if I can. That's the problem.
Yeah, when you use a green screen,
I won't do that anymore. Jake and Ava, A Boy and a Fish. It's to try and get kids thinking differently about fishes than just food or recreation. It's a story of fishing where a boy goes on his first fishing trip, and an archer fish goes on her first insect catching trip, and the stories converge when he catches the fish, and then it's a story of empathy after that. It's tapping into the same feelings I had when I was a young kid taking fishing. And in writing a book like that, I'm just trying to validate those natural feelings of empathy that are very common in us. And too often children don't get that validation. If anything, they get taught an opposite message by the behavior of a human who stomps on a spider or squashes a fly or what have you.
Thank you. Linda wrote in, how do we know fish are self-aware, and how do they compare with chimpanzees in solving problems?
I think Linda's read my book, What a Fish Knows. The self-awareness, I would go back to that mirror self-recognition study about the cleaner fishes. As for comparing fish intelligence with chimpanzees, when I was researching What a Fish Knows, I came across a published study that was intriguing because it actually did compare cleaner wrasses, the same species, in a problem-solving experiment with monkeys, in this case capuchins, and two kinds of great apes, common chimps and orangutans, and actually three kinds, because one of the researchers' 4-year-old daughter was also given the test. The test was very basic. It was two colored plates, pink plate or red plate and blue plate. And they both had food put on them, and they randomized it, so they mixed the order up. But the red plate, as I recall, was the one that had temporary food. The food was going to be removed 2 minutes later, or whatever the amount of time was. Blue plate, the food would be left. And so they presented these animals, these creatures, with this situation, and they were looking to see, would they learn to eat from the red plate first, because that's the food that's ephemeral, that's going to be taken away. That the logical response is to eat from the red plate first, that way, because you'll still have food, always have food on the blue plate. And the cleaner wrasse fishes learned to do this in about 30 or 40 trials. And the chimps and the orangutans didn't learn to do it, and the 4-year-old daughter didn't score as high as the fishes did on the same trial. It's a bit puzzling, because it seems like a very simple task to learn, but for whatever reason, the fishes were better at it than the chimps, and that probably relates to the need. Chimpanzees are mostly vegetarian. If they find a fig tree, there's not really a shortage of figs, and those figs are not going to disappear all of a sudden. So they maybe don't have to learn that lesson. Whereas the cleaner wrasses, as I said earlier, they need to learn how long it's been since a client was last there. So they probably have a better sense of time relationships. It's a common theme in biology. Animals are good at what's useful to them. Animals are good at what will help benefit them in their lives and make them pass their genes on to the next generation, to put it in a very crudely Darwinian way.
Well, thank you. Layla, who's watching live, says, I would love to hear more about what Jonathan knows about the dog and cat food industry.
Layla, I'm afraid to say I'm not much of an expert. I've lived with cats and occasionally with dogs. I love them. I love them. Wonderful creatures, but I've not lived with them recently and had to feed them. And I think that certainly with dogs do very well on a plant-based diet. I have a friend who had a cat who died last year at the age of 15, I think. And that cat was a vegan throughout her life. Cats can be vegan. I don't know if all cats can. Definitely, they're more obligate carnivores than dogs are. But if one has a meat-eating companion animal, a cat and a dog, and they want to feed them with animal products, then I would encourage them to go to the most well, I would say reputable and companies who maybe procure the food without from a non-factory farm source. But I haven't done my homework on that. I don't know what's available out there. But if it's a dog, you can really feed a dog very well on a plant-based diet. You don't, and I would say probably better, because there's so many pathogens and so many risks to the modern meat industry that you want to try and avoid, especially for animal foods, where I would say the regulations are less stringent than for food that's going to be eaten by humans, which in itself is problematic.
What do you say to people that say, well, animals eat other animals, so therefore we should eat other animals?
Yeah, I think the big word there is choice. We have a choice. I don't think it's our place to go out and try and get lions to stop preying on antelopes, just to use one example. They've evolved that way. They're predators. They're part of the ecosystem that way. Humans clearly evolved as omnivores. I don't particularly like the hunter-gatherer phrase. I would say more accurate is we evolved as a scavenger, gatherers, hunters, or perhaps gatherers, scavenger, hunters, in that order. We probably started eating meat opportunistically, particularly when we started developing tools, and then not long after that we started developing weapons, and so we started killing for ourselves. But I don't think I think we certainly, the health evidence shows that we thrive on a plant-based diet. And nowadays, if one wants to have meat, one can have meat made from plants. And very soon we'll be having meat made in labs where there was no factory farm, no transport truck, no slaughterhouse. So there's some emerging technologies that are actually giving some people in the privileged part of the world the options to continue eating meat-like products that never was from an animal who was suffering.
Yeah. Well, why do you think people eat meat? Do you really think they think it tastes that good? Because when meat tastes good, it's from the plants, it's from the barbecue sauce, it's from the cooking it and the oil and the sugar and salt. I mean, most people aren't like eating steak tartare and sushi as their main meat. They're eating, fast food burgers and things. Or do you really think that most people just really believe they need it, or it's just the culture? Like, why? I mean, why do people eat animals and not question it is my question, because I questioned it from like the time I was a little kid. Like, I just knew it was wrong and I didn't want to do it. So why do you think most people eat animals?
Yeah, you're a special case. You're a minority, I think. I think most of us, it's enculturated. It's kind of like learning to squash the spider in the house. It's what we're given and what we see, and we're constantly fed the messages of meat is high protein and it's concentrated protein and it's good. And then males get this whole kind of masculine thing about how it's more manly to eat your steak. I mean, this stuff, it's kind of bogus, but it's very persistent and it's passed on from generation to generation. So I think a lot of it is cultural. It's cultural messaging, and it's not so much that it's so tasty or great. I mean, I enjoyed meat growing up. I ate meat till I was 25, and I didn't stop eating it because I didn't like it. And I do like to buy the plant-based meats, partly because I like the taste, but also I like to support the companies for doing what they're doing. But I know full well that I'm doing my health bigger favor if I eat more at the base of the food chain, the plants directly, the vegetables and the fruits. And I love those too, but I like a variety. But that's not really answering the question. I think a lot of it's cultural. I think most of it's cultural and also convenience. I mean, just we've heard of food deserts where people in inner cities don't have access to fresh groceries, fresh produce. Often, that's a shame.
Yeah. Another question. Thank you, Linda, for all your questions that you sent in. How do flies use courtship before mating, and do some of them emit perfume?
Yeah, great question. I mean, fly sex is fascinating. It comes in 50 shades of brown, I like to say. And it's pretty exciting. I mean, just fruit flies alone, the males sing courtship songs. They flap their wings in at different frequencies to make different tones, and they're trying to appeal to the female that way. Females can reject or rebuff a male by extruding their reproductive parts, which sends a pheromone which says, bugger off, I'm not interested in you. She may also kick him in the head with her hind legs. And males have been found male fruit flies are more likely to consume alcohol if they've been rejected by females. I mention that because it seems rather human of them to do that. Alcohol is relevant here because alcohol is a byproduct of fruit fermentation. So fruit flies do consume a lot of alcohol or do encounter alcohol. Females will use alcohol also to repel wasps, parasitic wasps. Alcohol may be toxic to the wasp, and they'll consume more if they think there's wasps nearby that may harm them. So there's some very interesting relationships between fruit flies and alcohol. Just in general, courtship in insects is sometimes quite complex. There's also parental care. There are insects who care for and protect their young. But courtship may involve kissing, some behaviors that are perhaps a bit too graphic to describe in this public forum. But if you look in my book, you'll find some examples there.
Right. Um, some there are some diseases that we can get from certain insects, right?
Sure are. Yeah, flies, mosquitoes are credited with perhaps killing more humans through history. The only group of animals that exceeds humans in killing humans through history. There was a book published about a year ago, a year before my book, called Mosquito, and the author estimates, who's a military historian, he estimates that flies have killed almost half of the 112 billion odd humans who have ever walked the earth. Mosquitoes being the culprits. So, for all the good they do, and I hope I've made that point. There's also the bad side, of course, and the fact that they are disease vectors, very effective disease vectors, because they go after our blood, is a very serious problem. And there's ongoing research, of course, all the time to try to address yellow fever, dengue, malaria, of course, which kills a human about every 12 to 20 seconds, depending on which year it is. Very, very serious illnesses and conditions. And it's totally understandable that we're trying to solve these problems and come up with new ways to protect ourselves. including genetics, producing huge numbers of sterile males and releasing them into the environment to mate with females who will then not produce viable offspring. It's a challenging strategy, but it's one that's had some success.
Right. Zen's asking about frogs. Are they also disappearing?
Yeah, it's a recurring theme, Zen. Absolutely, as you may know, frogs are considered to be very good indicators of ecological health because they breathe through their skin. They need fairly clean water to be living in. I'm happy to say I see a lot of frogs around here in southern Ontario, including leopard frogs, which have struggled in some parts of their range. And I see bullfrogs and green frogs and wood frogs and lots of American toads. These ones are carrying Canadian passports, not American ones, but they're the same species. So it depends on where you are. But when I was a student in biology, and the dissection of frogs is so widespread, and it continues to be, that's an issue I'd really like to work on. I'm thinking about a children's book that addresses that issue. But frogs are in trouble in a global scale, because partly because of habitat loss, partly because of air and water pollution, which they depend on clean air and clean water for their survival.
Yeah. So Amal says, how do we get rid of fruit flies?
Hi, Amal. I write about this in some detail in my book Superfly, in terms of their cognition and their awareness and their ability to squeeze their bodies through little tight spaces to get at fruit, which is actually a good basis for a good fly trap. Take a bowl, put some fruit. The more rotting or older it is, the better. An old piece of banana, a fig, or some orange, a peach works very well. There's other types of fly traps. You can, humane fly traps, you can see videos of them on YouTube. Put, stretch some cellophane over it, poke a few little holes with a very sharp pointed end knife, tiny little slit holes. Those flies, any fruit flies you have in your kitchen or your home, will find it. They will find it. They will find their way. They've got an incredible sense of smell. They'll land on the cellophane and they'll crawl around on the surface. And you might actually, if you're lucky, be able to witness this. If they find an opening with this wafting, delightful, delicious smell of rotting fruit coming out, they will work their way in. They pry their way through that little slit, get in there, have their way with the fruit, enjoy themselves for a few days, but hopefully just a few hours, because you want to take them out regularly. Because they will have their entire life cycle in there, and after a while they want to get out, and they know how to squeeze out of those holes again afterwards. But it sort of works like a lobster trap. They're drawn in, they get the food, they're delighted, they're happy with their little world for a while. That's when you want to take them out. I've had it where I've had none when I go to bed at night. I've just set the trap. In the morning there's 50 flies in there. Yes, I know I should have fewer fruit flies in my kitchen, but I study flies, so I think I'm an exception. I can get away with it. And then I take them out, take the cellophane off, if it's warm part of the year, of course, and watch them fly away. And it's a very effective trap. But just be careful. If you don't empty it often enough, you might, instead of having a fly removal service, you'll have a fly breeding service. And one female can produce about 100 adult flies in about 2 weeks. So they're pretty prolific creatures.
That's a clever name for your book, because super fly, like fly, also means like you're really cool. You're really you know that, right?
Yeah, sure. And I've heard
super fly means like, hey, you're super fly.
Yeah,
man.
Curtis Mayfield's song. I've heard that video
Yeah.
quite a bit. So yeah, flies have Superfly has a kind of a cool sound.
Yeah.
My publisher was very happy with that title.
Yeah. So Jean says she would like to learn more about the fascinating information that you impart about animal cognition and behavior. Do you have any videos she can watch to learn more? And I know you've written a lot of books.
I've done about 6, and I'll do a little self-promotion by showing, again, I have this trouble with, you can't see.
I know it's the green screen.
Yeah, I need to get rid of that blur, but this is called What a Fish Knows. That's the European edition. And then Superfly, for what it's worth. You can't see that very well, but it's those are the best sources, is to read my books. Of course, authors like to say that, but it's not purely self-promotion. I do go into detail there there's a whole chapter on fly minds and how flies think. Similar with fish, several chapters on tool use and culture and that sort of thing in fishes. But absolutely, you can go online and you can see YouTube videos of most of these phenomena. You can watch flies courting on YouTube. You can watch flies probably solving problems. You can see fishes building their nest. You can see fishes using tools, blowing water on the sand to uncover a mollusk, then swimming to a rock to smash the mollusk open. You can see sharks showing restraint. I don't think it's a feeding frenzy. They're actually very careful not to harm each other. There's any number of things you can see. You can see fishes who will swim back into somebody's hand and be held out of the water. They trust them, and they like to be petted. And so all sorts of things you can see online these days.
Nice. Leslie, hi, Leslie. I'm trying to get Leslie to come on the show and do a cooking demo for like 2 years, so maybe she will now. She said that you once told her that you're fascinated with lizards. She loves occasionally feeding the cute anole lizards on her patio, but feels guilty for the poor mealworms she feeds them. The anoles have become tame and eat from my hand. Should she stop feeding them?
Your call. You got to go with your conscience there. You're hurting one animal and helping another. I've not tried that, and I've lived in Florida, and I love to watch the animals there. Um, I, I don't know where you're getting the mealworms. Maybe I don't know if you're buying them, but I used to watch mealworms getting eaten by bats in captive situations, and I always felt a little bit for the mealworm. So it's your call. I mean, if the animals are doing well, then they probably don't need you to do that. But they're going to catch their own insects anyway. So it's the circle of life. Again, we have a choice in what we eat. They don't have a choice, and I don't think we should judge them for that. And it doesn't sound like you're judging them for that.
Yeah.
You're being maybe hard on yourself.
It really sucks being a prey animal, doesn't it? I had a doctor on the show this week, and he has a pet snake, and he obviously has to feed this. Snakes, to my knowledge, can't be vegan, so he feeds the species appropriate diet. But that would really freak me out, both having the snake and feeding it live mouse.
Yeah, it's interesting that our most favorite pets or companion animals are carnivorous ones. The best companion animals, or just as good a companion animal as I ever had, were rats. Rats actually make great companion animals. Especially if you can get them young, so they can grow up around you and being used to be handled. They love to be petted. They're easy to feed. They're easy to please. My rats loved tofu. They loved frozen peas, leftovers. It was always a different meal every day, and they would always go with gusto and check it out. And of course, they had preferences. Some of them wouldn't eat certain foods, others would. And I would also play games with them. I got an old remnant curtain from a charity shop, and would lay it out over the floor, and they'd crawl under it, and I'd play a game where I'd tickle them and chase them away, and then they'd come back for more. They're really amazing animals, very playful, very social, and very easy to feed. I highly recommend a rat as a pet, or preferably two or more.
And my niece, who's asthmatic and couldn't have any furry animals growing up, for some reason was able to have rats.
Really, there was something about them. They were non.
Yes, they did not trigger her asthma, so that was the only pet she could have. And
yeah, they don't produce a lot of dander, I don't believe, or fur coming off.
She loved them. She had two, Ethel and Lucy.
Nice.
A question: if you plan on studying any other animals?
Yeah, I'm sort of between books right now. I mean, I'm working on several books for younger readers, actually. Another children's book idea involving an insect and a schoolgirl. But I've got a number of projects that I'm mulling over for a bigger kind of popular science adult book, possibly rodents. I've thought about reptiles. Snakes. I've always loved snakes, but I'm not sure there's enough material to buy a book yet.
I don't mean to be afraid of snakes, but I am, and I'm also afraid of spiders. But not every. It's funny. I'm not afraid of the ones that could kill me, the black widow, because they kind of stay by themselves. But since moving to the desert, we have this spider that I had never seen before called the wolf spider, and it carries like 100 babies on its back, and they come out at night, and I don't know what to do. I'm really terrified of them.
I think there is some evidence that snakes and spiders do elicit a visceral response that we inherit. It's not just a cultural learning. Most of our fears are culturally transmitted through the generations and not inherited. But I think there is some of that. So, don't feel too bad about having that fear. But they say that the best way to get over the fear is to be around the animal and to interact. So
Yeah,
I
you're
just put
talking
that
like
out there.
cognitive behavioral therapy.
I won't get
My
pushy.
way I get over it is I run the other way. I mean, I'm not going to hurt them, but I can't help it, Jonathan. I don't mean to be this way, but I really scream when, I mean, if they're outside, I don't mind, but if they're in the house, I really freak out, like really freak out.
Yeah, well, I would just say look for methods or people who are not afraid of them to help
Well, we
remove
have a
them from
bug.
the
That's
house.
why we have a bug zuka in every room. Suck them
Good,
in,
you're prepared.
catch and release. So there's a question: if you wash your organic produce first, does that help to eliminate fruit flies?
I have to confess ignorance on that question. I don't know. I've not heard that one way or the other. If the washing them reduces the smell, then I would suggest that that probably does reduce it. There's also that question: how do they get into our houses to begin with? Remarkably resourceful. My theory is they come in on bananas and fruit as in the egg stage, and then they hatch out, pupate, and then usually have adult flies. But I'm not certain if that's the case. So I don't have a very good answer for that one, I'm afraid.
Leslie says she grows the worms in an oatmeal box at home.
Oh, okay. So they'll feed on oatmeal. Yeah.
Mm.
Okay. Well, I would say if it helps to make you feel a little better, Leslie, it sounds like you're giving them a nice start. Those mealworms, they have perhaps days or a couple of weeks of the pleasure of tunneling their way through oatmeal before they suffer for 20, 30 seconds in the mouth of a lizard. So maybe not a bad trade-off for them.
So they're not mealworms, they're oatmeal worms.
Oatmeal worms, very good. I do like to say that I think it's important to recognize that any adult insect you see is a lottery winner. There's far more who fall by the wayside at each stage: egg stage, larva, pupa. Only the lucky few make it all the way to adulthood. So they're already winners. They've already done very well in life.
What is the lifespan of most insects?
The adult is in many cases just a reproductive phase. It's primarily, if not sole job, is to make more of itself or more of its species. And many of them don't even feed. They don't even have mouth parts. A lot of them do feed, and so there's a little more to it than that. But often the feeding, as is the case of mosquitoes, it's only the females who go after our blood, and they don't feed to satisfy their own hunger. They feed to nourish their eggs. They most of them need a blood meal to grow their eggs, so they can lay about 100 eggs on the surface of a body of water.
What about ants? Are they on your radar for
Ants
studying?
are fantastic. Ants are amazing. There's a lot of books about ants. I look at my bookshelf because I have a few there. Empire of the Ants, for instance. Stunning group of animals. Another group of animals that makes us scratch our head and say, maybe we've had it all wrong, thinking that we're the only smart creatures, or that only vertebrate animals have minds and emotions. Ants have some interesting relationship with flies, but just in general, ants, they're eusocial. They live in societies that are extremely tight knit. They can be violent. They have some very troublesome relationship with flies. There's some flies that have really taken advantage of ants. There's even a mosquito who will do a hovering dance in front of an ant, and it somehow transfixes the ant and causes the ant to open the mouth, and the mosquito sticks the proboscis down into the mouth and drinks the food in the ant's stomach, and then thank you very much, flies away, and then the ant gets on with their business. Weird stuff like that. There's some pretty weird relationships between ants and flies, and often not very good for the ants.
Wow. And some of them bite.
Ants, you bet they do. And some of them sting. The fire ants, I don't actually, I should know this, but the bullet ant is considered the most painful of all insect stings or bites. It's a toxin, and I've heard it described as a bit like having your hand drilled into with a drill.
Oh, not pleasant.
I'm
Diana
not
says,
looking for that.
yeah, yeah. Diana says, how do you know anything about the spotted lantern flies?
Yeah, I've heard about them. I've had a couple people email about them. I've seen pictures online. They look quite beautiful, but of course they are troublesome. They're a species that doesn't belong here. They've been brought here by us as usual, and they are wreaking havoc. I don't know details about what's the best way to deal with them if one has an infestation. I always still think that we should do our best to be ecological and humane in our methods if we can. Ecological in terms of not reaching for the poison or the chemicals. I think that's bad on two levels. It poisons the environment for animals who should be there, and it's also probably inhumane for the target species and possibly dangerous for the user as well. But uh, I always think that we tend to get taught too much negativity about so-called invasive species. I also encourage people to look in the mirror if they're thinking about invasive species. We belong to the most invasive species the planet's ever had. And I don't mean to sound anti-human with that. It's just a fact, and so it's good for us to be aware of that. But just as we wouldn't want to harm and hurt and make humans suffer if we were trying to deal with them as an invasive species, we should try to uphold similar standards for other species, I think.
Well, yeah, me too, but good luck convincing you can't really convince somebody to do the right thing if they're not, especially if they're not ready.
Well, we can at least give them information, and people are going to make their own decision. But if a few less people go and buy Raid at the local store, then I feel it's worth saying my bit.
Yeah. Absolutely. Leslie says her oatmeal worms are pampered with fresh apple slices and have the oatmeal box party life, beetle sex everywhere.
I'm
So
starting to wish I was one.
that's hilarious. Wow. So have you been able to influence any people in your life, friends or family members, to live a more compassionate vegan lifestyle because of your work?
Yeah, I mean, I really feel I have, and I don't say this to try and be special. I think when we make this decision to make the fundamental change in our life to stop consuming animals, whether we try or not, we're setting an example. And I think that perhaps setting an example is possibly the most powerful way that we generate change. People just see how we live, and they see a healthy, happy person, and they're inspired often to do that. I don't think we may not have to do a lot more than that. Only people who want to change will change, and so I think growing the populace who wants to change is the biggest challenge, and the kind of information that's available now, the kind of information that you share so effectively, AJ, the health effects, but also the various extended benefits. I think it's producing more people who are interested and who want to make that kind of change.
Right. And Leslie says she's ordering your book, Jake and Ava, today on Amazon for her grandson, unless she can get an autographed copy directly. And that's one of your books we haven't talked about. That's your latest book, correct?
Jake and Ava, a Boy and a Fish. Yeah, it's a children's book. The two parallel stories about a boy and the fish, and they meet, and the boy feels like I did when I pulled my first fish out of the lake. I saw an animal who was suffering, who was gasping to be able to breathe and couldn't, and was probably feeling the pain of a hook through the face. And I thought, I want kids to realize it's okay to feel bad about that, and it's okay to let the fish go. In fact, I think that's the best thing we can do. And then hang up our fishing gear, or if somebody was going to fish, use barbless hooks. There's any number of levels of at which we can make it less harmful than it was, but ideally abstention, and take up bird watching, take up fish watching, take up snorkeling. There's lots of ways we can interact benignly with fishes.
Do you think fish want to be our pets?
Probably not. I think captivity always is a compromise for the animal because it's confinement, and in most cases with fish. I was in another film called The Dark Hobby. It came out less than a year ago, and it's all about the sad ravages of the aquarium fish industry. The fact that the fishes are caught often in bad ways, explosives, poisons. A lot of them die and don't recover. Well, if they die, they obviously don't recover during that process. It's estimated that 90% of fish caught for the aquarium trade are dead before they reach their destination. And within a year, another 90% of the survivors are also dead. So do the math, it's almost a 99% mortality rate. And it's wildlife. Most of the fishes used in the aquarium trade are wild caught and shipped long distances. So it's a pretty problematic industry. Better to leave them in their own homes. And with modern technology, you can tune in on Netflix or wherever just as you can tune into a fireplace, a raging fire on your TV screen. You can also tune into aquariums and watch fishes in captivity or even in the wild that were filmed and on real reefs swimming around. What a great what a great replacement for the old aquarium approach.
Yeah. Well, it's just, this is just such an interesting topic, because you wonder, like, of course, nothing wants to be in captivity, but, like when you think about all the animals in the shelter, isn't it better that they're living in our houses with us than being put to death?
Sure. I mean, obviously, if fewer people would allow them to run loose and breed, we need to get more responsible about avoiding these animals from increasing their numbers and more of them on the streets. We've made great strides, haven't we? I mean, the number of cats and dogs euthanized, that's a euphemism, killed in shelters today is vastly less than it was 20 years ago. 20 years ago, it was tens of millions. And now I think it's a few million. Don't quote me on that, but I know the numbers have come down. That's been one of the great victories of the animal movement.
Yeah. What about birds? Have you studied them? Are they on your radar?
Again, I love birds. I'm an avid bird watcher, have been since the age of 8. I've seen about 1,400 species around the world over my 62 years of life, and I adore birds. I don't write about them much. I have written about them a little bit, but I don't focus on them because they're so popular and there's so many good books about them. I feel like I wouldn't be adding much of a new voice there. Again, I tend to go for the unpopular. It means I sell fewer books than maybe if I wrote about birds, but darn it, I enjoy it. I like writing about flies. I like writing about fishes, but birds are great. Birds are amazing. Birds have had their brains completely renamed, the parts of their brains, because the old brain, the old view of the bird brain. Yeah, birds have small brains because birds now need to be light and small to fly. But again, that miniaturization process, nature compacts so much intelligence and so much complexity into a small space. And with the brain of a bird, they can solve problems and do things just as special as what our vaunted mammals are able to do, the ones that we're members of. And so it's that recurring trend is if we look closer and examine animals' lives closely and ask good questions, we find, lo and behold, wow, look what they can do. Look what they're capable of. Their emotions, their individuality, their personalities, it's all there.
Amal says you have a very soothing voice. Do you do the audible version of your books?
It's a good question. I mean, the fish book does have an audible version. It was read by an actor who I thought did a very nice job. But I was invited and took up the invitation to do an audible version of my latest book, Fish Superfly. So that one, if you like my voice, which never been particularly enamored with my own voice, but it is available as an audiobook with me reading it.
Great. Well, you say you like to work with the ones that are less popular, and there's one that we haven't talked about that I don't really know anybody that loves these creatures, and that's cockroaches.
Yeah, and I would say there's no obligation to like them or love them. I mean, I've encountered them before, and I understand it. I have to. This is a bit gross, but I can't resist sharing an anecdote. I was in Israel once, 1994, for a conference for teachers. I was there to speak about animals, and this was to get teachers thinking about animals. And I happened to go to a restaurant in Tel Aviv with a fellow scientist and presenter. And wouldn't it be that my pasta dish, halfway through it, I lift up my pasta and there's a dead cockroach in my bowl. And he was mortified. I was like, wow, I feel really bad for that cockroach who died in a bowl of hot spaghetti. I wasn't freaked out. Obviously, the restaurant was extremely embarrassed to find this, and they compensated us accordingly. But I wasn't that fazed by that. Cockroaches are a little bit, yeah, they run fast and they're kind of spiny. They don't bite. I fed them in hotels in India once when I was traveling in India. I'm more interested in them as a subject to watch as an interesting behavior. And there is scientific evidence for pain perception in cockroaches, and they're pretty complex creatures. I totally get it though. People want them out of their homes. It just seems to be to me that if you bomb them with pesticides, which is what so many buildings do, they have this annual spray. Think about that for a second. If they're doing it every year, it sounds like it's not very effective because it's not finishing them off. They come back every year and you're left with poison as well. So when I've encountered cockroaches, and it's been a long time since I did, I've had American cockroaches, German cockroaches. There's just a few species that benefit by being in humans' homes. Most of the species live in the wild. I just grab them in my hand, and maybe a lot of people are not comfortable with that, but that critter catcher probably would work well. and take them
They're
outside.
fast, though. That's the thing. Spiders aren't, well, the wolf spider is pretty fast. And that's interesting that you said they exterminated once a month, because for years I was an apartment manager and it was once a year in your building. It's once a month everywhere in LA when they exterminate.
There's a message there. It tells me that they're not being effective at all. It's just they're making their money because they have the contract every year to do that, and they're leaving poison behind. I think it's a mistake. It's the wrong approach. Okay, they're hard to catch. I have caught them with my bare hands. I can, but let's say you can't catch them that way, then I would research to see what kind of traps are available. I'm sure there are some traps, some of them probably lethal traps, and maybe some
I
non-lethal.
actually have somebody on the show that's like an ethical, that I don't know the answer, but there is an answer to do this ethically. And it's a upcoming guest on the show that whose whole business is this ethical
Great.
extermination. Yeah, I know
Great.
that
Well,
sounds weird. It's not extermination, but you know what I mean. There's no, but do cockroaches play a role in our survival?
totally. I mean, everyone does. Every creature, every species. The fact that cockroaches are numerous and successful means that they probably play a bigger role than a lot of other creatures, because they're going to be food to others. Others benefit from them. But by the way, just going back to the whole extermination thing and the whole what should I do if, as long as there's food available, then they're going to come back. These are resilient creatures. They've been around us for a long time. They can manage. They get killed in large numbers by us, but they persist. Excuse me. So as long as we're putting food out, the basic advice on keeping mice and rats at bay is to exclude them, to block any entrance holes, but also cover the food, keep it in metal tins. It's a lot of work, I realize, but if you clean up your kitchen and you have everything contained well that a rodent or a cockroach can't get into, they're not going to stick around. There's nothing for them to eat. So more challenging for cockroaches who go for small stuff. It doesn't take much to feed them. But if you take that strategy, it's a preventative strategy, you might have better success.
Well, you're saying some of these insects don't even have a mouth.
Yeah, well, cockroaches aren't among them. They do have mouths and they do have appetites, and they do like to feed. That is what draws them in.
Yeah, this is so fascinating. Well, thank you for the work you do. It's really quite fascinating.
Thanks, AJ. It is. I don't get tired of talking about this stuff. So let me know when you want to talk again, and we'll do that. I hope.
And so what's the next book? Are you allowed to say what you're working on now?
Sure. I haven't approached publishers yet. I've only just notified my literary agent about a book about a girl and a caterpillar, similar type of story approach to The Boy and the Fish, obviously a different animal, but it relates to a number of issues that come up. I mentioned a few subjects that I'm mulling over. Virtue in animals is another one I've thought about writing. I haven't decided on that, but I have a couple of manuscripts for middle school readers that I've done, one on fish and one on smart animals, just some of the amazing things that animals do. Those are works in progress.
Oh, great. Well, thank you so much, Jonathan. It's a
Cheers,
pleasure
AJ.
talking to you.
Real pleasure speaking to you too. Thanks.
And thanks all of you for watching another episode of Chef AJ Live. Please come back tomorrow when my guest is Dr. Peter Rogers. He's very, very smart. Thanks, Jonathan. Be well. Take care.